Okay, well, thank you and welcome to our 40th episode of Ideas and Lives. I'm Bob Lerman, a social policy economist, and I have my partner.
Steve Odie, a financial economist.
And we've gotten together to interview people we know who've had interesting careers and compelling ideas. And today we certainly have one who fits that description in Carl Gershman. Um, Carl has had an illustrious career, especially in terms of building up efforts to spread democracy and sustain democracy. Welcome, Carl.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So we always start with where you grew up, what your parents did, where you went to high school. So give us a description of your early life.
Well, I'm a New Yorker, and by New Yorker, I mean Manhattan. And by Manhattan, I mean both the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side, where I grew up. We moved from the Upper West Side to the East Side when I was 13 years old. And then when I got married, we moved right back to the Upper West Side, the Belnord on 86th Street and Broadway. Murders in the Building. They have that video right now.
Yeah.
Shows, which is great, and it made the building famous, which is fine. Um, and I had a kind of a bifurcated education. I'm gonna say my father was a lawyer. Not an intellectual, but a lawyer, dealing mostly with real estate law. My mother had been a school teacher, but she raised the family. She had an interest in theater, but also she developed a very lovely art collection. She had a real taste for all of that. Um, and I went to a Jewish day school, Ramaz, through the sixth grade. Not, very long, but it gave me a certain grounding that I only really appreciated later. And after the sixth grade, I went to the Horace Mann Day School, Horace Mann School up in Riverdale, New York, which was a very, very different place. The one being traditional and Jewish, the other, while being mostly Jewish, was also very secular, progressive, um, trying to be in touch with some of the, you know, political developments that were beginning to emerge in the late 1950s and became eventually the 1960s. And I certainly was touched by that, but I was touched by both of these things. I didn't fully appreciate that there was a tension there. And it probably is a tension that shaped my life. Um, and, when I was at Horace Mann, sometimes I would almost feel a little bit embarrassed to have had this traditional background. But I realized later on that it was extremely important in keeping me grounded, keeping me connected to reality during the period of, the 60s and the New Left, making me sort of more a centrist and a moderate than I might have otherwise been.
Hmm.
You never know what shapes these things, and we can talk about it. But I didn't really have much of a political background from high school, from family, but I found it and I developed it, and we can talk about that.
Yeah. So then what any big highlights in high school that you recall?
No, more, maybe college. My years in college, I went to Yale, were from 1961 to 65, which was, the beginning of the 60s,
Yeah.
the good half of the 60s, before things really got bad. I mean, in a certain sense in which I wrote this in a little bio for our 60th reunion recently, that right in the middle of our 4 years there, you had, uh, within just in the same year and within just a few months of each other, you had the March on Washington, which showed the promise of the 60s, and you had the assassination of JFK, which set in motion so many, terrible things. Um, and I was searching what to do with myself. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer, but I really didn't want to be a lawyer. It was not going to satisfy me. I didn't know what I wanted to do. But in my senior year, there was a bit of a civil rights center at Yale. People like Al Lowenstein and some others. And in over Thanksgiving in my senior year, which was in 1964, right after the big summer where a lot of young people went down south, I drove to Mississippi with a couple of British graduate students and spent the Thanksgiving days uh, doing voter registration work in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And
What year was that?
it was in November, Thanksgiving of 1964.
Okay.
And in a way that, and then in March, I went down to Selma, a second trip in my senior year. And I also did one activity that was extracurricular. At the Divinity School had a program called Link, where a student would have four kids from the local ghetto housing project. And you meet them once a week and you take them somewhere. And I really enjoyed it. I got along with the kids and the families and so forth. And when I graduated, again, not knowing what to do with my life, I joined the VISTA program, Volunteers in Service to America, this was part of the poverty program of LBJ. And I was sent to Chicago for 6 weeks of training, living in the projects in the south of Chicago. And then I was sent to Pittsburgh. And it was a kind of program where they didn't tell you what to do. You had to make your own job. And, I became a kind of a community organizer. I was a little bit influenced by the ideas of Saul Alinsky at that time, and a little bit, on the edges of the New Left. Um, and I also, worked with a lot of the teenagers that were in the Job Corps. I was a basketball player, so I played basketball with them, and then I would take them to the theater. The Pittsburgh Playhouse, they would have regular plays, and I could, get a number of free tickets to bring a dozen of the teenagers that I was working with to the Playhouse. But I also then set up a link program when I first got there because it was really all I knew how to do. And I think, from the summer to December, and then there were VISTA volunteers all over the city, but I got them to do it. We recruited 200 link leaders in 8 different neighborhoods of the Pittsburgh area, and had, like
What is a link leader?
a
Explain
link
that.
leader was what I was. In other words, a student who meets with 4 or 5
Ah,
kids, mostly in the ghetto, or in the poor neighborhoods, but it was there were Vista volunteers in 8 different neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, and they all wanted to join this program because they didn't know what to do either. I mean, nobody gave anybody any direction. But by December, we had 200 link leaders and 800 to 1,000 kids in this program.
wow.
And they even brought me to Washington. How'd you do this? You don't have any money? How'd you do something like that? But it was great, and I was rooted in the community. I did a lot with the community. Once in a while, and I'm not terribly proud of this in retrospect, but Saul Alinsky had this idea that you organize communities by rubbing raw the sores of discontent, and I sort of did
Right.
that. And I wasn't terribly. I don't think I necessarily accomplished things that were very constructive with that. But what happened was that I was in Pittsburgh for 2 years. I made some local friends. One of whom was started a weekly liberal newspaper in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Point, and I wrote for it. Um, I wrote an article for it, a little bit pretentious, but it was the first time I tried my hand at political social analysis, and I was connecting the Isaac Deutscher trilogy about Trotsky, and I want to emphasize that I knew very little about that stuff. But in any event, I connected that with what I saw was the fact that the New Left had run out of steam. We were in a period of going back, backwards, or certainly where there was no longer any forward momentum. And Trotsky, of course, and the biography, it's the centerpiece of that is, post-revolution, the rise of Stalin and the exile of Trotsky. So I made some connection between that and were there any lessons for that for the New Left movement today? And I mean, going back and reading that article, I could see that I was a bit of a new leftist with certain views that America was, very, complacent, and there were, the kind of problems I picked out were sort of a new left interpretation. I was critical of the new left in the article, but I also, in a way, there was something that sort of struck me in it, where I was sort of saying that, sometimes to recognize limitations, find uh, to be a passionate moderate, a pragmatist, and a realist was in its own way heroic. I thought that was interesting, and I could see in that what I had written there, the seeds of something that might grow into, because I didn't know what I was at the time. And I had this friend who was an edit, like the deputy editor at the Pittsburgh Point, who knew that I was searching, and he said, you might want to write to this organization called the League for Industrial Democracy, it was an organization created in 1905 by Jack London and Upton Sinclair, and it was a kind of a social democratic organization. So I did. And what happened was that, when I got they sent a list of publications and pamphlets that they had, and I ordered a few of them. One of them was the article, a reprint of an article that Bayard Rustin had written in Commentary magazine at the beginning of 1965 called From Protest to Politics. He had written it in Commentary, and he had written it about a year and a half after the March on Washington, which he organized. And I was really blown away by the article. And because I didn't see a great deal of potential in the community organizing. And he talked about the problems for the poor Black community, what I even he called the underclass, the problems, Kenneth Clark, had thought that these problems were were pathological. And this was also post-Moynihan report about the breakup of the Negro family, the absence of, um, fathers. And it was a in many ways, they were not just losing jobs because of automation, jobs, leaving the inner city, but you had serious problems of, drugs and crime and broken families and so forth. And I realized that this is the central problem. And Bayard Rustin, had this A. Philip Randolph freedom budget, which was a big public program to try to rebuild the cities and create a lot of jobs and do all those things. And I was struck by that. And it struck me as much more of a constructive and effective program than what I was doing. And during my last months in the spring and early summer of 1967, when I was there, I would give talks about what he was saying because I thought it was very, very important. And he became a kind of a hero of mine, Bayard Rustin. And I then, again, because I still didn't know what to do with myself, there was a program that the Harvard Graduate School of Education had, a Master's of Education for General Purposes. And I could go there. I only had to take one ed course each semester, and I could take other courses and catch up on all the political science and sociology and other things that I didn't study when I was an undergraduate at Yale.
What did you study at Yale?
I was an English major,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
but uh, but what happened was when I got to Harvard in the September of 1967, one of the first things I saw on the front page of the New York Times was a photograph of Bayard Rustin with Al Shanker. And it surprised me because Shanker didn't have the reputation as being a kind of a activist the way Bayard was in the civil rights struggle. Quite the contrary. And he had gotten into conflicts with the Black community and so forth. So I wrote to the same fellow at the LID that I had written to before. His name was Paul Feldman, who himself was something of a intellectual and writer, and who I said, what accounts for their connection? And he wrote me, a little bit about the problem of decentralization of New York schools, which I was beginning to understand because they were experimenting with three schools at that time. This later, the following year, burst out into the Ocean Hill-Brownsville controversy when
When you
Shanker.
say the League of Industrial Democracy was experimenting with schools?
No, the New York school system.
Yeah,
The New
okay,
York school system took three schools, IS 201, a school in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, to experiment. And the idea was to have not only decentralization, but community control.
right.
And I then, when I wrote to this Paul Feldman, he said, well, he knew I came from New York. So he said, when you're in New York, you should go by and meet with people at the teachers union and hear what they have to say about this issue, and you might learn something. So I did that. And what I discovered, I didn't know that who the people, really what their background was that I was meeting with. But the people I met with at the UFT were all in the Socialist Party, and they
Hmm.
were all followers of the political ideological leader Max Shachtman. In fact, what I discovered and I met that day that the executive secretary to Al Shanker, the teacher union president, was Yetta Shachtman. I didn't know really who she was. Turned out was a very interesting person. I mean, she grew up in Chicago, was a friend of Saul Bellow, who spoke at her funeral when, a long time later when, after she passed away. Um, but I started meeting people and I didn't realize it, but they saw me as a potential recruit. And I went back to Harvard. Their point of view on decentralization was that it was it was not going to do anything for poor blacks. It was and potentially very dangerous with community control, a kind of very divisive activist issue, which could lead to a lot of problems, which of course it did. And at the same time, when I was even, I think that during that Thanksgiving in '67, when I was meeting with the UFD, McGeorge Bundy, who was head of the Ford Foundation, they came out with a big report endorsing decentralization. And the line of the UFT was that this was a way for the white liberals to wash their hands of the whole problem and just turn the schools over to the black radicals who were demanding control, community control. And I wrote my paper at Harvard on that, basically picking up the line of the UFT. It got very favorable response, and and then I in the next
Even at Harvard, where they
at
went.
Harvard I did. I mean, in fact, the person who reviewed my paper saw it as a liberal betrayal of poor blacks, which it was in a way, a cynical liberal betrayal. And I then, in the next semester, one of the reasons I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education is I had been attracted to the ideas of Moynihan. And I took a course with him in the second semester.
Mm.
And I enjoyed it, and I sort of appreciated his analysis. I was aware of all, he had come to Pittsburgh, speak at Chatham College when I was there, and I went to the lecture, and I was very impressed with him. So he was another person that was sort of I was attracted to and influenced by his thought. And then when I went into New York after graduating, I still didn't know what to do, but I didn't fully appreciate that this movement that I was connecting to through the UFT wanted to recruit me. And so the first thing that happened was I got a phone call from somebody who was a member of that movement offering me a job at the Anti-Defamation League to follow the left. They had traditionally followed the right because their focus was anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism was mostly a problem on the right. But after the Six-Day War in June of '67, there was kind of beginning an outburst of anti-Israel sentiment on the campuses, and the New Left turned very sharply anti-Israel. And they wanted to have somebody to follow that, and they thought that I would be the person to do it. So I got that job. And in the course of waiting for that job, I got a phone call from a fellow named Josh Moravchik, who later became a well-known intellectual, who was the leader of the youth group of the Socialist Party, Young People's Socialist League,
Mm.
who invited me to join him on 125th Street at Bayard Rustin's office, because Bayard at the time was trying to help salvage the Poor People's Campaign. 2 months after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, he was trying to salvage this because it really was going off the rails. And he said, we can go up maybe and help. And I went up with him that day. Bayard wasn't there. And we just spent the afternoon talking. And I had a conversation with him about Vietnam and about communism. And it was the first time I ever had somebody challenge me on the idea of what will happen to the people of South Vietnam if the communists win. Have you thought about that? Well, of course I hadn't. And I didn't fully understand these issues, but it was a tough conversation. And I realized I had a lot to learn. And this was 1968, a very pivotal year. And one of the things that happened in that year, in addition to King's assassination and Bobby Kennedy and the Democratic Convention, was that the group that these people that I was meeting in the Socialist Party, the Shachtmanites and their allies, took over the Socialist Party at the convention in Detroit that July with a point of view called realignment, where they were going into the Democratic Party. In other words, we're no longer going to be a party running candidates. We are going into the Democratic Party and build a liberal labor civil rights coalition in the Democratic Party. And realignment, I mean, in the end, it turned out to be a ridiculous idea. Was you get rid of the Southern conservatives, and then you have a really social democratic party, the Democratic Party, with a liberal labor civil rights coalition. And that group took over the party. And I was invited to a kind of gathering that they were having after the convention when they took the majority. And at that gathering, I met with Paul Feldman, and he invited me to join the editorial board of New America, which was the newspaper of the Socialist Party. And then he also said, but if and I said, great, I'd love to do that. He said, but you have to be a member of the party in order to do that. I said, sure, I'll be a member. I didn't fully realize the significance of what I was doing. But the long and the short of it, and I'm sorry, going on in this way, was that I was getting absorbed into a movement that was going to shape my life, which still at that point did not have a real focus as yet. Um,
But
at
the
the ADL,
socialists
huh?
now, I mean, weren't the socialists quite anti-US involvement in Vietnam? I mean,
Well, what happened was that the group that I was associated with had two different positions in it. I mean, people that had a strong anti-communist position and people who were for immediate withdrawal. But those factions stayed together during the effort to take over the party. And they had a program called Negotiation Now, which was a compromise.
yeah,
You know, we want a negotiated solution. And we want to see the troops out, but we want a negotiated solution. And there was the potential for a split within that group. Michael Harrington, the sort of most prominent socialist intellectual and leader, was the head of the became the chairman of the party because he had written this book in '62 called The Other
the other
America,
America.
and was famous. And but he himself was a Shachtmanite. And when I say Shachtman, let me just say a brief word about who he was.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, including me, are not that familiar.
All
I don't
right.
know about
Well,
you three, but
there's a biography of him by a fellow, not the economist, by the name of Peter Drucker, and he had written a lot, but he had a very interesting political career. But the sum total of it is that when he was born in 1904, and when he was still a teenager, not yet in his 20s, he not only became a revolutionary communist, but the head of the whole youth section of the American Communist Party. Um, but then when the uh, uh, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union split and expelled Trotsky, he went with the Trotskyists. He rejected Stalin and became one of maybe the leading follower of Leon Trotsky in the United States. Um, and in the 1930s, as they were, trying to organize their own group outside the framework of the Communist Party, he split with Trotsky because Trotsky continued to believe that the Soviet Union was a worker state because they had abolished private property.
yeah,
But he said it's not, it's something different. He called it bureaucratic collectivism. He was very anti-Soviet, anti-communist. People like Irving Kristol and B. Himmelfarb, B. Kristol, were part of his group,
mm,
that little group that they had in the early 1940s. He was a charismatic figure who was able to bring talented people around him. And he continued to evolve. He continued to evolve. And in 1958, his group, which was called the International Socialist League, and had people like Michael Harrington in it, Irving Howe was around it, not in it, uh, but they, in effect, merged with the Socialist Party. And with the line of realignment, in other words, of we want
yeah,
to eventually enter the Democratic Party. And he was becoming not only a democratic socialist, but in international policy, uh, not only was he an anti-communist, but he eventually broke with the third camp position. In other words, that we're not going to be either with the U.S. or with the Soviet Union. We're going to be independent. He broke with that and realized that to be a real anti-communist, you had to side with the West
yeah.
and the United States.
The non-aligned, I believe they called it back then.
No, that non-aligned movement was different. That was the radical third world movement. That's
Yeah,
different, and that has, in a way, is part of this history. But he wanted to establish an alliance with the AFL-CIO under the leadership of George Meany, which was strongly anti-communist and pro-American. And that started, in 1958. But by the time they took over the party in 1968, the whole Democratic Party had totally changed because of Vietnam and the racial protests. It was
yeah,
a split party. And that split of the in the Democratic Party ultimately split the Socialist Party. And I joined in 68, and so the split came in 1972, in a way precipitated by the McGovern nomination. But I I became active and even a kind of younger leader in the organization during that period and absorbing the ideas of the organization. And it was a group that was aligned with the AFL-CIO and George Meany and strongly anti-communist and was, against immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. Um, and it was, yeah, and in a way pro-American. And then the leader of the other side, which the sort of so-called McGovern side or the new politics side, was Michael Harrington. And in 1971, 72, this group that I had joined was totally taken up in a very bitter faction fight. But and in the end, the the AFL-CIO was neutral in the election, with McGovern, but uh, the this this these tensions split the party, and at the
And
convention.
what job did you have during this period? I mean,
Oh, I should have said this. I should have
you
said
might
this.
have needed to
Yeah,
make
thank
some
you,
money.
thank you,
Well,
thank you for raising that. Thank you for raising that. I
we're
spent,
economists. We kind of
yeah, no, that was
focus in
fundamental,
on
and I
concrete.
should have I should have talked about that because that really gets to what the heart of it. I spent 6 months at the Anti-Defamation League. I met my wife, which was great. One thing shaped my life. But in December, I started in June, and in December, I got a phone call from a fellow named Norman Hill,
Oh yeah.
who was the deputy to Bayard Rustin at the A. Philip Randolph Institute. And he called me and said, "Would you like to come to the A. Philip Randolph Institute and be the research director and, in effect, the writer for Bayard Rustin?" So, of course, I said, "Wow, my hero." Um, and so in January of 1969, I left the ADL
So
and I went
how do you think he got to know why he should hire you for that
because
position?
what happened was that they first were trying to recruit me. And then after I joined the party in July of 1968, I started writing articles. And I
Hmm.
was one of the younger intellectuals coming along. And Bayard had somebody who did that for him, but that person left and they were looking for another person. And I was obviously a leading candidate for that job, and they offered it to me. And it was incredibly fortuitous because we hit it off beautifully. It was a great place to be absorbed into the movement. And I wrote a million, we would talk about everything, and then I would write articles. I not only wrote a biweekly column, but I wrote articles for Harper's Magazine on the failure of Black separatism, blacks and the unions,
Wow.
articles published in Dissent magazine, a word to black students. I mean, it was an incredibly exciting time when I was very, very productive, doing my own writing as well.
A
Irving
lot of
Howe,
these they sound topical, many of
huh?
many of the pieces sound topical.
Well, they were. I mean,
No, I mean today, even
oh, well, yeah. Well, I mean,
some of them
Bayard,
anyway.
what I discovered about Bayard was that he was the most remarkable, maybe the most remarkable person I've ever known, because he was so idiosyncratic, so unique. He was a pacifist who spent 3 years in prison during World War II,
Wow.
but then, because of the Holocaust, I think, became Israel's strongest defender in the black community during a period in the late 60s of rising black anti-Semitism. And he supported, when I was there, one of the things he did was he supported this pacifist, supported selling US jets to Israel.
Hmm.
And he also created an organization called Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. Um, he was also a a leftist. He
Yeah.
had been a member of the Young Communist League in the 1930s. He broke, for a lot of reasons, and A. Philip Randolph had something to do with that. But when the Soviet, when the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, which had been supporting some protest actions for blacks before that, to integrate the defense industries, immediately pulled back because they were supporting the Soviet Union, not blacks. And when he saw that, he resigned from the Communist Party, Young Communist League, and eventually became part of the Shachtman group and a fervent anti-communist. This once, in other words, a remarkable person, this pacifist, this this anti-communist socialist or social democrat, and also he was a radical, considered to be a radical in the civil rights movement, uh, organizing one of the main protest.
He was, but wasn't he involved? I mean, wasn't he a union person or?
Well, what happened was this: he
I mean,
organized them.
what kind of revenue did he get? How did he get it? How
Well,
did
I'll
he
tell you.
sustain
I'll tell
himself?
you. He organized the March on Washington in 1963, where King gave the famous speech, "I Have a Dream." And then after that, he created the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and that was the basis of From Protest to Politics. And blacks not only had to go into politics to get something like the freedom budget passed, but they could only do that in alliance with labor. Labor was the basis of it, and it was labor that supported the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the
Hmm.
AFL-CIO, the ILGW, all the different international unions. Uh, and um, this civil rights radical in the 1960s, after the March on Washington, when you had Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, and the rise of Black Power and Black separatism, he became the strongest opponent of that in the Black community, the strongest
Hmm.
opponent. So he was this incredibly idiosyncratic figure, a joy to be around,
Yeah.
a terrific art collector. He also was a great singer. He
Hmm.
supported himself in the 1930s by joining a quintet run by Josh White, and he had this beautiful tenor voice. And when we would organize fundraising dinners, he would always bring the house down by singing "Oh Freedom." Um,
Hmm.
and they made a movie about Bayard's life called Brother Outsider, a documentary in 2003. And all the background music is him singing. It's a terrific piece.
Hmm.
But I here I was now not only working with Bayard, but we became I started in 1969. He died in 1967, 1987. And for the last 18 years of his life, we were extremely close. And at one point, he was the national chairman of Social Democrats USA, which is what the group became after the split. It changed the name from Socialist Party to Social
So you
Democrats.
you work for him as research director. I think we're going to have to move quickly because we have a lot to say about your democracy work.
All right. Well, let me get to that quickly. But uh, he, what I in becoming part of this movement and participating in the faction fight and then becoming the executive director of the Social Democrats in 1974, the central principle of our work was democracy. It's where even, long before they created the National Endowment for Democracy, this became the central guiding light, guiding principle of this movement that I was a part of. And not only was I, when I became director of the Social Democrats, focused on building a close tie with labor, but I also was the key was to take actions to support the emerging uh, freedom movement in the world with the Soviet dissidents and other movements around the world. I sort of placed the Social Democrats at the cutting edge, the forefront of support for the global struggle for freedom in the world. And in addition, I would bring around. I wanted to bring intellectuals into the Social Democrats because we were very small, and I thought by having prominent intellectuals, it would help us elevate our reputation, our appeal. And I recruited Sidney Hook to
Hmm.
the Social Democrats. He became a very, very close friend. And then I invited him to give the keynote address to the Social Democrats convention in 1976, where he talked about for Social Democrats, freedom always comes first. And for Social Democrats, democracy is not just a political principle, it's a moral principle. And this is the center of our politics. And I also then, for the next convention, recruited Leszek Kolakowski, the Polish philosopher, maybe one of the leading intellectuals in the whole world, to give the keynote address, where he too spoke about the core being freedom, and freedom is the source of all the other principles that social democrats espouse. Um, and he even in this address that he gave, because I was asking him, how can you breathe life into this idea of social democracy? He called upon the West adopting a strategic perspective of putting of steady and unremitting pressure on the totalitarians, on the Soviet Union, to sort of encourage the peaceful, nonviolent collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. And I became then a very close associate of these intellectuals, Leszek Kolakowski. There were others that I recruited, like the novelist James T. Farrell, Midge Decter, the wife of Norman Podhoretz, and then Moynihan himself, where when Moynihan went to the UN, I sort of reached out to him because he had written an article and commentary called "The United States in Opposition," where he was blaming the radical anti-American non-aligned movement. That's where non-aligned comes in, the non-aligned movement, NAM, blaming their anti-Americanism on what he called the British Socialist Revolution. In other words, it was Britain through its colonial policy with India, which brought socialism to the third world, and that they are not part of the Soviet Union. They're not part of the communists, the sort of the first world, or the U.S., or the second world, the Soviet Union. This is the third world, and it's different, but it was very strongly anti-American. And he was saying the United States has to go into opposition to this non-aligned majority in the UN. And I said, look, we want to work with you when you're going to be at the UN. And we actually had a meeting at the home of the Podhoretzes, Norman Podhoretz and Midge Decter, where we brought Moynihan to talk to the group. And he and Bayard got together because they had a little bit of a falling out over when Moynihan wrote that benign neglect memo for Nixon on race. But also, I mean, the Trillings, Lionel Trilling was still alive, and he was there, and Diane Trilling and Fritz Stern, a lot of Robert Conquest, a lot of interesting intellectuals were there, and we were building up a center. And then when Moynihan went to the UN, we did become in a way, the center of his support network. And we organized a big reception honoring him 2 weeks after his opposition to the Zionism equals racism resolution at the United Nations. We had the big reception at the U.S. mission to the UN, and he wrote a big article in the American Scholar saying that this little social democratic group, was the best able to make the case for supporting America in the global struggle today. And he became our leading advocate. It was, very sort of exciting to be developing these relationships. And even to make a long story short, my work in for a dozen years in the Social Democrats became a kind of apprenticeship for me for eventually going to the National Endowment for Democracy. And the reason I was chosen as president of the National Endowment for Democracy was not only because of this background that I had, but also in building the alliance with the labor movement. I became very close to Meany's successor as the president of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland. And my wife and I became very close with him and his wife, Irina Kirkland, who, interestingly, was a Jewish survivor of Auschwitz. And they believed as deeply as we did in democracy. And when Reagan then gave that speech to the British Parliament in 1982, I was by the way, working at that time. I had left the Social Democrats and I was working with Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick at the UN. So I was actually working this social democrat working. We were friends. She asked me to come along with her when she was chosen, and I was the U.S. representative in the third committee of the United Nations, able to, do all the things I was doing before in terms of my activities and writing about communism. I was able to take that to the floor of the General Assembly. And my first speech, I had 13 rights of reply from the entire Soviet bloc for my first speech in the United. In any event, when Reagan gave that speech and they were looking for somebody to run the new National Endowment for Democracy, I had this background, and Lane Kirkland had the most influence of everyone in choosing the first president of the National Endowment for Democracy, and he wanted to bring me to Washington anyway, me and my wife, because we were very close friends with him and Irina Kirkland. So that's how it all happened. And I had this apprenticeship, which then led to my going to the National Endowment for Democracy. I hope that's all clear.
No, no, no. It's great. It's great.
But I haven't let you ask any questions.
No, no. Well, you answered them along the way. But now let's talk a little bit about your term as
Well, what's your attitude? Yeah, what's your attitude towards socialism in America today?
Well, it's a very interesting question. When we split in 1972, Harrington's group, which left us, was called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. In 1982, they merged with something called the New American Movement, which was much farther to the left. And Harrington had a no enemies on the left position after he left us. Before that, he shared Shachtman's anti-communism. That group became Democratic Socialists of America, which is today AOC, that left-wing splinter. And we were the Bolsheviks in a way, the majority. We beat Harrington, but then his group became this Democratic Socialists of America. And by the way, it's sort of an ironic story. When they were merging with the New American Movement, Irving Howe got all upset. He was with Harrington. He got all upset because he thought they were going to become anti-Israel. And to keep Howe into Democratic Socialists of America, to keep him part of it, they promised never to go anti-Israel. And now Democratic Socialists of America is passionately for the destruction of Israel, supporting Hamas. I mean, Irving, he died a long time ago, but would be turning over in his grave.
Yeah, yeah.
I have no use for it, as my answer to your question, see.
Did some of the people that you said Rustin died in 87?
Yeah.
So he wasn't able to witness the decline of the Soviet Union
No, and Sidney Hook died right after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. Shachtman died in 72.
I see.
And his death was a really big deal, and it created, a vacuum. And I partially filled that vacuum. I was, obviously without any of those kinds of abilities, but I had absorbed this spirit that he created in this movement, and that, that stayed with me for my whole life. And I brought that, and brought, what Sidney Hook represented. I brought that to it's very interesting. I brought that to the National Endowment for Democracy. And National Endowment for Democracy was Washington. It was a big deal. Reagan had given this speech, some called it his greatest speech, the Westminster Address to the British Parliament in June of 1982. And you would think that it had all this support, and here comes this New York intellectual. What is he going to do? He doesn't know anything. I didn't know Congress. And I didn't realize that I was walking into a real problem because there were people who saw the Ned was very controversial, much more so than I realized. There were people who saw it as a Reagan anti-communist organization because I worked for Kirkpatrick. It was neoconservative. They didn't like the idea that both of our parties were creating institutes would work internationally, and they called it a boondoggle. They were going to just send people on political junkets. The conservatives believed that we would not appreciate the importance of so-called friendly tyrants, conservative governments that were anti-communist, like the Chilean government. So there was a lot of opposition to it. And one month after I started on my job, 1 month, the House of Representatives voted to kill the organization. And it wasn't even clear that it was going to survive. And what I realized was in order to preserve the NED and build it, I had to do what I was doing at the Social Democrats. I had to become a passionate advocate for democracy, not a Washington bureaucrat of a big political organization, but a movement. An organization had to become a movement based on values, based on struggle, based on supporting people around the world who shared these values. And with that point of view, it took a long time, but with that point of view, eventually we established firm bipartisan support. It took 15 years. After 9/11, because before 9/11 in the 1990s, after the collapse of communism, people say, well, we don't need this anymore. Communism has been destroyed. And in any event, AID is entered the business. Our government could get into this. You didn't need an independent organization like the NED to support democratic activists around the world. AID can do it. And of course, it can't, and now it doesn't exist anymore. But after 9/11, which ended what Charles Krauthammer called the vacation from history. After 9/11, the guy that had been trying to kill the NED in the Congress, in our Appropriations Committee in the Senate, Senator Judd Gregg, saw that we put into our strategy paper for 2002 how to support democracy in the Muslim world. And immediately said his staff contacted us and said, if you can boil that down to a page and give it to me. We did. The next thing you know, Judge Gregg, who had been trying to kill the NED, was calling for doubling our budget. Bush called for doubling the budget in his State of the Union in 2004 after he spoke at our 20th anniversary event in 2003. And between 9/11, 2001, and 2019, the budget that NED had grew by 10 times.
Wow.
So,
So what would you say are the main, because I want to get to Ukraine in a minute, but your work on Ukraine, which is after the NED, right? But what were some of the main highlights at the NED in terms of uh, capabilities and so on and outcomes?
well, look, you got to look at it in periods and stages. The first 5 years we got go, I started in 1984 and I stayed there 37 years. It's an independent organization. I was not an administration appointee. I was appointed by a bipartisan board. Um, and in the beginning, the idea was how do you build credibility for the idea of what we're doing? Because a lot of people thought it's ridiculous. You can't do it. Biden called it a boondoggle when he was a senator. It was only when all the people coming into his office in 1989 and 1990 were telling him that about the support that they got from us and how important we were for supporting those struggles. That was part of how we built this support. And he once said to me, I testified before a subcommittee, I was wrong and you were right. I thought NED was a boondoggle, and it wasn't. And he was even saying, I want to give more money to NED because it has such an important job to do. So that was the first period. The second period was the 90s, the vacation from history, which was a very tough time because you didn't need NED anymore, they thought, and also the government could do the work. We don't need a non-governmental organization to do this. And they had the illusion that every country was going to be like Poland. They were all going to love us. And you didn't need something like that. So that lasted until 9/11. And then in the 2000s, the really critical thing was not just the financial crisis, but the backlash against democracy. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine sort of gave Putin the awareness that he had to kill this foreign support for democracy because we were helpful in Ukraine. He blamed it all on us. And at that moment in 2004, and then thereafter, they started cracking down on democracy assistance and declaring people receiving it foreign agents and so forth. And so we had what we called the backlash against democracy. That was the third stage of this. And that backlash continued to grow. You also had, Sam Huntington wrote a book called The Third Wave of Democratization, which is what Reagan called the Democratic Revolution in his 1982 address. And it was the sort of spread of democracy in the 1980s and early 90s. And Huntington also said that democratic waves are followed by reverse waves. And after the 2004, 2005, the backlash, you started getting a kind of global, what Larry Diamond called a democratic recession. I would say that it was actually a reverse wave, where Freedom House has charted the decline of democracy or political and civil rights every year since 2006, 18, 19 consecutive years since that time. And then that spread to the Democratic West uh, and illiberal populism, and sort of illiberal trends spreading everywhere. So it became a much, much different and more difficult struggle during that period. But during that period, the NED continued to grow because we were seen in the Congress as the best operation going to support this. And then let me just say a word about today, that the Trump administration um, has wanted, since the beginning, has wanted to kill NED. And it's impounded its funds. It's zeroed out its budget in the budget request. It impounded the funding. The NED challenged it in court, and they won in court. And the Trump administration has now did not appeal its recent court loss in a judgment by a judge just last week. And uh, so they're now trying to kill it by doing an audit, which would try to find things that they've done that are wrong to try to kill it in a different way. And the guy who's, heads the budget office used to run an organization that produced a paper on that. And you mentioned Ukraine. And the paper said that the support that NED, I was running NED at the time, the support that NED gave to NGOs and civil society and independent media in Ukraine over decades was actually, it was called Ukraine warmongering, because this support created in a way, an obligation to support Ukrainian democracy and freedom. And that creates the U.S., the view of some people in the U.S. that we have to support Ukraine when it's been attacked by Russia. And they call this Ukraine warmongering. Of course, it's not. But I think that what I think that NED is going to survive this terrible period. And when it does, it may be the only thing left standing, because USAID has now been killed.
What what do you think, looking broadly, you were talking about helping democracy in the Muslim world. Where are we seeing successes and um reversals there?
Well,
Seems
of
like
course, yeah,
Turkey is a bit of a reversal.
it
Um,
is a reversal. It's part of the recession. That's true. Um, but
is
you
Indonesia doing better? Uh,
Indonesia is backsliding now too. Look, you had the Arab Spring in 2011, and that first burst. The Muslim world was bypassed by the third wave of democratization. We never got any requests for support. There was no movement in the Muslim world before that we saw before the great revolutions of 1989 and 91. We started getting a lot of people from the Muslim world coming to us for support in the 1990s. And then you had the Arab Spring, which sort of ended the sort of separation of the Muslim world from the rest of the world in terms of efforts to try to fight for democracy. But there was an immense backlash against the Arab Spring. Even the one country where it succeeded, Tunisia, the authoritarians retook power. But what's happened remarkably, and you wrote a very good article on this, Bob, was that when Israel defended itself against the attack of October 7th, and realized that in order to protect itself, it had to not only defeat Hamas, but also to defeat Hezbollah, because ultimately the core of the opposition to Israel was in Iran. And they couldn't really go after Iran if you had Hezbollah, which was ready to drop 150,000 rockets on Israel. So they had to defeat Hezbollah first, which they did. And then they were able to attack Iran. But in doing that, they opened up the way, as you pointed out, for a democratic opening in Lebanon, where the Iranian control, the Shia control of Lebanon, made it impossible to sort of restore the limited democracy that they had before. And then the Assad regime in Syria collapsed. And you now have the prospect for a democratic transition in Syria. By the way, am going to be going
Would
with.
Ned work with groups there?
We have. We had a deep program even during the Assad period. The Ned had a strong grants program in Syria. And after the fall of Assad, all of these independent media and civil society grantees have gone back to Syria because a lot of them were in exile. They're now gone back and are working within Syria, which is very, very important. And next month, I'm going with a Jewish delegation to Syria, to Damascus, to meet with this government. And there's a real debate in Israel over whether they should, they don't, I think they're making a mistake in not trying to support this new government to make a successful transition. A lot of people who follow this say that Israel wants a weak and fragmented Syria on its border. I think they would do much better if they could have a member of the Abraham Accords and a peaceful neighbor on their border. And I do believe it's possible. And we're going to be going there, and we'll know more about it after our visit to Damascus in the middle of June.
I'll be very interested. Let's close with your work on your current work in trying to help Ukraine. What does that consist of?
Well, as I said before, it's not the first time I'm trying to help Ukraine,
No, I know, but
but I'm
now,
working with an organization called the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, which has supported the creation of a special tribunal on Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which is now in existence. It was just formally established in June, and it's under the auspices of the Council of Europe, and it's a kind of a joint initiative of the Ukraine government and the Council of Europe, and they have they could indict Putin for the crime of aggression. He was indicted and sentenced or charged by the ICC for the crime of the abduction of tens of thousands of children. But this is a tribunal whose sole focus is the crime of aggression. And this U.S. Ukraine Foundation has supported that, and I'm now working on that issue, in addition to working to build opposition to the abduction of children, the weaponization of sexual violence, the torture of prisoners, trying to build an international parliamentary coalition for Ukraine. I'm working with the University of Michigan, a center there called the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, which has produced a teaching guide on how to teach in American high schools and colleges and other centers of education around the world how to teach about Russian war crimes to introduce this subject into the academic discipline. And
what about, I mean, Ukraine is in some sense seems like a fairly new democracy. It's not entirely new, but it's new in the sense of very free elections, it seems. Sustaining that.
Well, it is a new democracy because it really wasn't a democracy under Kuchma, right after the collapse of it was independent of Russia, um, which of course is what Putin is trying to reverse. But it became uh, more independent after the uprising of 2013 and 2014, and where they ousted uh, the pro-Russian government, and it was right after that in 2014 that Putin annexed Crimea and started the war in 2014 in the Donbass.
But then they had another election, right? Ukraine
They
had
had an
it.
election because they were not formally at war, and in 2019, Zelensky was elected. They were a much more democratic country after the revolution of 2014, and uh, they they what Putin is afraid of, what Putin is most afraid of, is having on his border a country like Ukraine with its history, which was part of the Soviet Union, in a sense controlled by Russia, but could be part of a free European civilization, which could really threaten what he represents, which is great Russian chauvinism, and with the potential, if Ukraine is successful, of having a different Russia. There are still Russians who want that. People like Vladimir Kara-Murza, Navalny wanted that. Um, but the only way to get there, is for Ukraine to win the war, for Ukraine to survive. This is something that is not understood by our current administration, although gradually, the rejections, the problems they're having with Putin is opening their eyes to this problem. Um, but that's what really this struggle is about. When I attended a meeting in Ukraine in 2014, the former Swedish prime minister at that meeting said that Ukraine was the epicenter of the global struggle for democracy. Quite a remarkable statement in 2014. I believe that it is. It's still the epicenter. And if Ukraine can survive and become, what it was trying to do before, which is to become a part of European civilization, a democratic country, part of European civilization. Ultimately, I believe this progress will spread further, will spread to the east, that Russia, it will affect Russia. And this is what Putin fears. In a way, that's ultimately what
Well,
he's.
let's hope that happens.
Well, it's possible. It's possible,
And
although it's such a troubled country.
the Ukrainians seem to have displayed an amazing ingenuity in the face of enormous constraints, and let's hope that continues along
No,
with.
nobody expected that. Even some of its best friends. Nobody could have imagined that they would resist in the way they have, and also as creatively, developing a whole defense industry.
Yeah. Well, Carl, it's a pleasure to talk to you about your career and your ideas and what you've been able to do in promoting democracy. Zvi, you have any parting thoughts?
Well, lots of identification with what Carl had to say. He and I went to college at the same time, 1961 to 65, flirted with socialism, and I went off to Israel to live on a kibbutz. It was slightly different, but
Only slightly.
only slightly, and but I can identify with all the things that he was involved in.
Bob,
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that I'm aware how tough this period is. We have the 250th anniversary of our Constitution coming up, and I work with a Greek American organization who told me that the Greeks used to so admire the American struggle. Their independence struggle was in 1821, and their constitution was adopted in 1823. And they actually had amendments in their constitution quoting our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. But that admiration for America no longer exists, I regret to say. And we have an enormous challenge in this country.
Well, I'm a little more optimistic, as I usually am, but I think we'll come back from all of that, and hopefully Israel
I
will
hope
as
you're
well.
right. I hope you're right.
But anyway, thank you for all your work and your continuing work in this field, and it's been a pleasure talking with you. And as we always end with Zvi's
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's see, where do I hit stop? So I'm gonna stop the recording.
All right, I'm going to sign off.